James always admired how close-knit his family was. After his mother passed away when he was 16, his father, Robert, had stepped up in every way. He became more than a father. He was James's confidant, his mentor, and in many ways, his hero. That bond only grew stronger as James got older, married Emily, and started building a life of his own. Emily had fit seamlessly into their world. She had a way of making people feel comfortable, and Robert had taken to her almost instantly. He often joked, "James, you married up, and I mean way up." Those words used to make James proud. Now, they made him sick. It started small, little things James brushed off as paranoia. Emily began working late more often, coming home after James was already asleep. When he asked about it, she would kiss his cheek, tell him she was catching up on deadlines, and change the subject. Robert, as always, was supportive. "You've got a good one, James. You're lucky she works so hard." But there were other things James couldn't ignore. Like the way Emily and Robert would share private jokes during family dinners, laughing at something that didn't quite land with him. Or the way her face lit up when Robert entered the room. A brightness James hadn't seen directed at him in years. Still, he pushed the doubts aside. This was Emily. His Emily. She would never betray him. Then came the receipts. James had been cleaning out the attic on a rainy Sunday when he stumbled upon a shoebox tucked in the corner. He wasn't the snooping type, but curiosity got the better of him. Inside, he found a collection of papers, receipts from fancy restaurants, boutique hotels, and even a spa resort, none of which he'd been to with Emily. At first, James thought they might belong to his father, who sometimes stored old paperwork at their house. But as he sifted through the box, his stomach dropped. 2 of the receipts were dated for nights when Emily had told him she was working late. And the credit card signature on one of them wasn't hers. It was Robert's. James sat on the attic floor for what felt like hours, replaying months of small, insignificant moments in his mind. The way Emily hugged Robert just a little too long. The way she always seemed to linger when dropping off leftovers at his house. The text she was quick to hide when her phone buzzed at the dinner table. For the first time, James allowed himself to entertain the unthinkable. Still, he didn't want to jump to conclusions. He told himself there had to be an explanation. Maybe Robert had just been kind, paying for dinner to help Emily unwind after a stressful day. Maybe this was all in his head. But deep down, he knew better. That night, while Emily was in the shower, James unlocked her phone. He wasn't proud of it. He hated invading her privacy, but he needed to know the truth. And he found it. A message from Robert, sitting in plain sight. "I can't stop thinking about last night. Same time next week? Love you." The words hit James like a freight train. His hands trembled as he stared at the screen, his heart pounding in his ears. Emily stepped out of the bathroom, wrapped in a towel, humming to herself. She froze when she saw James holding her phone. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice sharp. James didn't respond. He held up the phone, the message displayed like a neon sign of her betrayal. Her face went pale. For a moment, she opened her mouth, as if to deny it, but no words came out. "Emily," James said, his voice breaking, "tell me this isn't what it looks like." But she didn't. The silence between James and Emily stretched unbearably. She stood frozen in the doorway, her wet hair dripping onto the carpet, her face pale and void of excuses. James felt his heart splinter with each second that passed without an explanation. Finally, she spoke. "James, I can explain." "No." James roared, the anger surging through him like a storm. He stood abruptly, the phone shaking in his hand. "Don't you dare try to explain this. Don't you dare." Emily flinched at his tone, but quickly composed herself, crossing her arms as if preparing for a fight. "It's not what you think." James let out a humorless laugh, his voice heavy with disbelief. "Not what I think. You've been sneaking around with my father, Emily. What could it possibly be if not that?" Emily's lips trembled, and for a moment, James thought he saw a flicker of shame in her eyes. But then, she snapped back, her voice defensive. "You don't understand what it's been like, James. You're always at work, always busy with your own things. Robert, he was there for me in ways you weren't." James staggered back as if she'd slapped him. You're blaming me? Do you hear yourself right now? His voice cracked, a mixture of fury and heartbreak. You betrayed me. You betrayed us. And with my own father? Emily's gaze fell to the floor, her defenses crumbling. It wasn't supposed to happen, she whispered. It just did. I never meant to hurt you. James clenched his fists, fighting the urge to scream. You didn't mean to hurt me? You've been lying to me for months, sneaking around behind my back. And you have the audacity to say you didn't mean to hurt me? The weight of the betrayal crushed him, but one question burned brighter than the others. How long, Emily? How long has this been going on? She hesitated, her silence stretching until it became unbearable. 6 months, she finally admitted, her voice barely audible. James felt the floor drop out from beneath him. 6 months? He shook his head in disbelief. You've been sleeping with my father for half a year, and you've been coming home to me every night like nothing was wrong? Emily's eyes welled up with tears. I was confused, she said weakly. Confused? James shouted. You don't get confused and fall into bed with someone. You choose to do that. And you chose him. Over me. Over us. Before Emily could respond, the front door opened. James turned to see Robert standing there, holding a bag of groceries. He froze when he saw James and Emily in the living room, the tension thick and suffocating. What's going on? Robert asked, his voice cautious. James's rage boiled over. He grabbed the phone and shoved it toward his father. Why don't you tell me, Dad? You've been texting my wife behind my back. 6 months, huh? You've been playing happy family with Emily while I've been too blind to see it. Robert's face went pale, and the calm, confident man James had always admired seemed to crumble before him. James, he began, but James cut him off. Don't you dare try to talk your way out of this. James stepped closer, his voice trembling with fury. You were supposed to be my father, my role model. And you do this? With my wife. Robert placed the groceries on the floor, his hands raised in a weak gesture of surrender. I never meant for you to find out this way. James let out a bitter laugh. Oh, so that's the problem? Not the fact that you betrayed me, but the fact that I found out. Emily tried to intervene, stepping between them. James, please, we need to talk about this. But James wasn't listening. He was done talking. He grabbed his keys from the counter, his vision blurred by tears. Don't bother trying to explain, he spat. You can have each other. James, wait. Emily called after him, but he was already out the door, slamming it behind him. James drove aimlessly, his thoughts a whirlwind of anger, betrayal, and disbelief. The two people he trusted most had destroyed his world, and he didn't know how to move forward. He pulled into an empty parking lot and sat in silence, staring at his hands on the steering wheel. For the first time in his life, James felt completely untethered, like a ship lost at sea with no compass, no anchor, and no hope of finding his way back. But one thing was clear. He couldn't go back. Not to them. Not after this. James sat in the dark parking lot for what felt like hours, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He replayed the confrontation over and over in his mind, each word cutting deeper. The image of Emily standing there, pale and guilty, and Robert's weak attempt at justification were seared into his brain. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat, dragging him out of his thoughts. It was Emily. He watched her name light up the screen, the sound of the vibrations filling the suffocating silence. He couldn't bring himself to answer. Instead, he flung the phone into the back seat and got out of the car, the crisp night air hitting him like a slap. He didn't know where to go, but he knew he couldn't stay here, drowning in his anger. James found himself walking along the empty streets, his thoughts spiraling. How had he missed the signs? How had everything fallen apart so quickly? He felt foolish for trusting them both so blindly. Emily, who had vowed to love him. Robert, the man he had admired his whole life. They had made a mockery of everything he held dear, and now he was left to pick up the pieces of a life that felt irreparably shattered. He ended up at his best friend Matt's house. Matt and James had been inseparable since high school, and though they didn't see each other as much these days, James knew Matt was the one person he could trust. When Matt opened the door, wearing sweatpants and a confused expression. He didn't ask any questions. "You look like hell," he said, stepping aside to let James in. James collapsed onto the couch, his head in his hands. "It's bad, Matt. Worse than anything I've ever dealt with." Matt sat across from him, a concerned frown on his face. "Talk to me. What happened?" James hesitated, the words sticking in his throat. But as he looked at his oldest friend, he felt the dam break. He told Matt everything, finding the receipts, the text message, Emily's confession, and Robert's betrayal. By the time he finished, his voice was hoarse, and his chest felt hollow. Matt was silent for a moment, his expression a mix of disbelief and anger. "James," he said finally, his voice low, I don't even know what to say, man. Your wife and your dad? That's some next-level betrayal." James let out a bitter laugh. "Tell me about it. What are you going to do?" Matt asked. "I don't know," James admitted. "I left. I don't even want to look at them right now. But I don't know what's next. How do you move on from something like this?" Matt leaned forward, his expression serious. "Look, you've been through hell tonight. But one thing I know about you, James, is that you're stronger than this. You've been dealt a shitty hand, no doubt, but you're not the kind of guy who lets it break him." James sighed, leaning back against the couch. "I don't feel strong right now. I feel empty, like I don't even know who I am without them." Matt clapped a hand on James's shoulder. "You're James fucking Marshall. You don't need them. You've got your own life, your own worth. And you've got me. Whatever you need, I'm here for you, man." For the first time that night, James felt a flicker of hope. Maybe Matt was right. Maybe he could rebuild, piece by painful piece. The next morning, James woke up to sunlight streaming through Matt's living room window. His head was pounding, and his body felt heavy with exhaustion. But as he sat up, the events of the previous night came rushing back. His phone, which Matt had retrieved from the car, was buzzing with notifications, calls, texts, even voicemails. Emily and Robert had both tried to reach him, but James ignored them all. Instead, he opened his messages and typed out a single text. "I'll be in touch when I'm ready. Don't contact me until then." He sent it to both Emily and Robert, then blocked their numbers. It was time to take control of his life again. In the days that followed, James focused on himself. He threw himself into work, hit the gym harder than ever, and even reconnected with old friends. It wasn't easy. Nights were the hardest, when the loneliness crept in and the memories of happier times threatened to drown him. But slowly, James began to feel like himself again. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He deserved better than the people who had betrayed him. One evening, as he was clearing out the house he had once shared with Emily, James found a photo of his parents and him as a boy. It was taken at a summer picnic, their smiles wide and genuine. He stared at the photo for a long time before tearing it in half. He was done clinging to the past. It was time to build a future on his own terms. 2 weeks passed before James felt ready to face Emily and Robert again. The initial shock had dulled into a simmering anger, and while the pain lingered, he no longer felt like it controlled him. With the support of his friend Matt and a resolve to reclaim his life, James decided it was time to address the people who had shattered his world. He arranged to meet them both at Robert's house. It was neutral territory, a place filled with memories of family gatherings, memories now tainted by betrayal. When James arrived, Emily was already there, sitting stiffly on the couch. She looked pale and tired, her eyes red from crying. Robert stood near the fireplace, his usual confidence replaced with a quiet unease. "James," Robert started, his voice tentative. James held up a hand to stop him. "Don't. I'm not here for excuses. I'm here to say my piece." He stood in the middle of the room, the weight of their stares pressing down on him, but he didn't waver. "I've spent the past 2 weeks trying to make sense of this," James began, his voice steady but firm. "Trying to understand how the two people I trusted most could do this to me. And you know what? I realize there's no explanation that will ever make it okay." Emily opened her mouth to speak, but James cut her off. "Don't. You don't get to defend this. You lied to me, cheated on me, and with him of all people. Do you have any idea what that's done to me?" Emily's eyes filled with tears, But James didn't let it sway him. He turned his gaze to Robert. "And you," he said, his voice hardening. "You were supposed to be my father, the man I looked up to. You taught me about loyalty, about respect, about family. And then you turned around and did this? With my wife." Robert looked down, shame flickering across his face. "James, I know I let you down." "Let me down?" James interrupted, his voice rising. "You destroyed everything. You didn't just betray me. You destroyed this family. And for what? Some twisted fling?" The room fell silent, the weight of James's words hanging in the air. "I've spent my whole life trying to be the man you raised me to be," James continued, his voice breaking slightly. "But now I see that the man I was trying to live up to doesn't exist. You're a fraud." Robert flinched at the words, but James didn't stop. "From now on, you're nothing to me. I can't look at you, can't even think about you without feeling sick. You're not my father anymore." Robert's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. James turned to Emily, his expression colder than she'd ever seen it. "And as for you, I loved you. I would have done anything for you. But now, all I feel is disgust. You made your choice, and now you have to live with it." "James, please," Emily whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I know I hurt you, but I still love you. We can fix this." "Fix this?" James said, laughing bitterly. "There's nothing left to fix, Emily. You destroyed us." He took a deep breath, his voice steady again. "I want a divorce. You can keep the house, the car, whatever. I don't care. I just want you out of my life." Emily sobbed quietly, but James didn't look back at her. As James walked out of the house, a weight lifted off his shoulders. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of clarity. He couldn't change what had happened, but he could decide what came next. Robert and Emily's actions had shattered his trust, but they wouldn't shatter him. James was determined to rebuild, stronger and wiser than before. And as he drove away from the house that had once been a symbol of family, he realized something important. He didn't need their apologies. Their guilt, their shame, that was theirs to carry. James had a life to live, and he wasn't going to waste another second on people who didn't deserve him. After James walked out, the silence in Robert's house was deafening. Emily sat on the couch, her face buried in her hands as sobs racked her body. Robert stood frozen by the fireplace, staring at the floor. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on them both like a suffocating fog. "We ruined him," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible between sobs. Robert finally looked up, his face etched with regret. "I know," he said softly. "I know we did." Emily lifted her head, her tear-streaked face twisting with anger. "Why didn't you stop it? You're his father, for God's sake. You should have known better." Robert flinched, but he didn't argue. He couldn't. "I was stupid," he admitted. "Stupid and selfish. I let my feelings cloud my judgment. I thought it was harmless." Emily let out a bitter laugh. "Harmless? You think sneaking around behind his back, destroying his trust, was harmless? We've destroyed everything, Robert. Everything." Robert sighed, running a hand through his gray hair. "It wasn't just me, Emily. You made choices too." Emily's face crumpled as fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "I know I did," she said, her voice breaking. "And now I've lost him. I've lost the only man I ever truly loved." In the weeks that followed, the consequences of their betrayal began to take shape. For Robert, the fallout hit Robert hard. Word of the scandal spread quickly among family and friends. James had confided in his siblings, who were furious with their father. His daughter, Lauren, refused to speak to him, calling him a disgrace to the family. His youngest son, Mark, sent a terse message, "You're dead to me." The family gatherings that had once been the cornerstone of their lives disappeared overnight. Invitations stopped coming, and even casual acquaintances avoided him. Robert, who had always been the pillar of their family, was now a pariah. Loneliness consumed him. The betrayal hadn't just cost him his relationship with James. It had severed his ties to the family he'd spent decades nurturing. One night, sitting alone in his empty house, Robert stared at the photo of his late wife. "I failed him," he said aloud, his voice echoing in the silence. I failed them all. But the guilt wasn't enough to repair what he'd broken. For Emily's life unraveled just as quickly. James filed for divorce within days of their confrontation, and she moved out of their shared home. Her friends, many of whom had known James for years, distanced themselves from her. The loneliness was unbearable, but the worst part was knowing she had no one to blame but herself. She spent her nights scrolling through old photos of her and James, her heart aching with regret. She tried reaching out to James several times, but he never responded. Her texts were left unread, her voicemails unanswered. Desperate for closure, Emily showed up at James's office one afternoon. She waited for him outside, her heart pounding as he approached. "What do you want, Emily?" James asked, his tone cold and detached. I just want to talk," she stammered. "To apologize." James stared at her for a moment before shaking his head. "It's too late for apologies. You made your choice. Now live with it." And with that, he walked away, leaving Emily standing there, tears streaming down her face. The turning point. Months later, Emily and Robert crossed paths at a grocery store. Both looked worse for wear. Robert's face was gaunt, his once confident demeanor replaced with a quiet sadness. Emily looked equally worn, her eyes dull and tired. They stood awkwardly in the aisle, neither wanting to speak first. Finally, Robert broke the silence. "Have you heard from him?" he asked, his voice tentative. Emily shook her head. "No, he wants nothing to do with either of us." Robert nodded, the weight of her words settling over him. "Do you regret it?" Emily asked suddenly, her voice trembling. Robert looked at her, his eyes filled with a sadness she'd never seen before. "Every day," he admitted. "I don't know what I was thinking. I lost my son, Emily, my family. And for what? A mistake I can never take back." Emily bit her lip, tears welling in her eyes. I thought we could fix it. But there's no fixing this, is there?" Robert didn't answer. He didn't need to. They both knew the truth. As they parted ways, each walked away with the crushing realization that their choices had left them both utterly alone.